Hello, my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby importers and distributors, and welcome to episode 6, Operation Veritable and Operation Grenade, the push to the Rhine. Towards the end of the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, could now look forward to the big push into Germany. This would be in 3 main attacks. 2 further south with US 12th Army Group and 6th Army Group, and the 3rd in the north with 21st Army Group, with US 9th Army attached in a pincer movement. The US 9th Army would attack over the River Roer under Operation Grenade, and 1st Canadian Army, part of 21st Army Group, coming from the north between the Maas and the Rhine towards Cleve and the Reichswald Forest under Operation Veritable. These attacks were planned for early January 1945, but the Battle of the Bulge delayed these until early February 1945. The lead unit would be the Canadian 1st Army, heavily reinforced with British units, and they would go into the attack with over 300,000 men, 35,000 vehicles and 1,500 guns, against the Germans approximately 90,000 and about 1,000 guns, but very few tanks and self-propelled guns. The Germans were using delay tactics by flooding the land in front of US Army just in front of the River Roer start line, so this basically chucked the plan up in the air. The Canadian 1st Army, back now under the command of General Crerar, who had been ill before the Battle of the Scheldt, was quite weak in strength, so it was bolstered, as I said earlier, by British units, including 30 Corps under General Horrocks, one of the best corps commanders on the Western Front. For all Montgomery's faults, Eisenhower knew Montgomery was the best general for a set-piece battle, and 21st Army Group were planning this for some months. And behind the German lines, out of their artillery range, and after Bodenplatte, little interference from the Luftwaffe, and help from poor weather, 21st Army Group set up a massive logistical and gathering area, some hundreds of square miles in size. Here gathered all the equipment and ammunition 21st Army Group would need to assault the Rhineland and actually get across the Rhine itself. Thousands of tons of shells plus fuel plus reserve vehicles were gathered at night under utmost secrecy. There were high numbers of engineers and pioneers who will need to build and repair roads and construct bridges. Also in place were the specialist vehicles from 79th Army Division or Hobart's Funnies. It was likely the Germans would try to destroy any bridges and roads to help slow the Allies down. The ground was hard from frost, so that would help the movement of vehicles, but there was a thaw in late January 1945, turning the ground into a muddy quagmire, and 21st Army Group were trying to move about 10,000 tons of stores a day in preparation for the oncoming battles. So this really hampered the logistics specialists at 21st Army Group. 21st Army Group were running what you call signal deception plans to convince the Germans the attack's going to go straight north into the Netherlands. But German generals thought, well, no, probably they're going to go west straight to the Ruhr industrial areas. But the general of the 1st Parachute Army, his patrols had noticed that there were British patrols in front of the town of Cleve. The objective was Wesel behind 3 German defensive lines, a forward line, the Siegfried line and the Schlieffen line. Defending these lines were the 1st Parachute Army, 47th Panzer Corps plus Volksgrenadier divisions with a total of about 90,000 men. In the first week of February 1945, Canadian Army with 30 Corps attached started to form up on a line between Nijmegen on the Rhine and south toward the River Maas. This consisted of the 3rd and 2nd Canadian Infantry Divisions, the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, 30 Corps with its 15th Scottish Division, 53rd Welsh Division, 51st Highland Division and Guards Armoured Division. Also there would be 4th Armoured Brigade, 43rd Wessex Division and the 11th Armoured Division transferred from British 2nd Army in reserve. So one of the largest and strongest British and Commonwealth forces to date, with good solid leadership and much better tactics learned earlier in the Second World War. The plan was the Canadians would take the ground north of Cleve towards the Rhine, 15th Scottish would take the actual town of Cleve or city of Cleve, 53rd Welsh the high ground southwest of Cleve, 51st Highland Division in with the squirrels in the Reichswald Forest and on the road towards Gok. 21st Army Group hoped to get these areas before the Germans could rush more heavy reserves in. If this worked, 43rd Wessex Division would then push through the gap south of Cleve on the road to Gelkern or Geldern in the south, and Guards armoured a dash towards Wesel. This was planned to take 4 to 5 days. Whole but the plans of mice and men. An old city north of a forest area remind the Germans of another, Aachen and the Ertgen, and their propaganda started to big this up, but Montgomery, for all his faults, was not one for wasting his troops. So on the 7th of February he called in Bomber Command, and 750 Royal Air Force heavies absolutely flattened Cleve and Gok and pounded the squirrels in the Reichswald Forest, plus areas in the back of the battle area were also pounded by Royal Air Force Bomber Command. At 0500 hours, 1,000 guns opened up on the German 84th Division, made up of the very young and very old who were defending the German first line of defence. This was the largest British barrage since Second Alamein, and the largest yet in northwest Europe. Attackers and defenders were literally deafened as the guns pounded the German lines for hours before the Allied armour and infantry went into the attack at about 10:30 hours. The infantry made good progress and large numbers of the Germans were surrendering, totally demoralised by the artillery barrage. But heavy rain was making the ground hard going for armour, with many tanks literally bogging down. But the funnies of the 79th Army Division, again Obart's funny, did make progress, and Churchill crocodiles were soon turning on Germans willing to put up any form of a fight. After hard fighting in tough conditions, the lead elements had already reached the main anti-tank ditches of the Siegfried Line by 1830 hours. In one of the largest traffic jams of the Northwest Europe campaign, some 20 kilometres long leading up to the Siegfried Line. Special breaching units were stuck in the traffic for hours, all bogged down on alternate routes trying to get up to the front line. So it's a good job the Luftwaffe were nowhere to be seen and the weather was pretty awful. But early on the second day, the assault over the Siegfried Line had started and was soon overcome. In fact, some units had not even realised they'd actually crossed the line. One of the vehicles helping with the advance, again, was the Canadian Ram Kangaroo, used by, again, 79th Army Division, to move infantry up towards the city of Cleve. By 1700, it was starting to get dark, but 30 Corps infantry and supporting armour had already taken the high ground west of Cleve, just as the first German reinforcements were getting to the area. 53rd Welsh Division had fought through the forest and its tanks were already hitting German vehicles trying to get to Cleve. 51st Highland Division had also done their objective after bitter fighting in the southport of the Reichswald Forest and the roads leading to Gok. Natural floods and German flooding in the area north of Cleve to the Rhine could have made this part of the operation almost impossible, but the Canadian 3rd Division was well equipped with amphibious vehicles such as the DUKW and the LVT-4 or Water Buffalo as the British and Commonwealth called them. Some of the villages were on higher ground and the Germans were defending these, but Canadian infantry in their buffaloes successfully assaulted these areas and took them, as you can see behind me, with rare pictures of the buffaloes actually in action. By the end of the second day, Horrocks was confident even though the actions was behind scheduled. He called up 43rd Wessex Division to push through to the high ground near Cleve held by 15th Scottish Division. There were traffic jams were causing delays, but after 12 hours, the 43rd Division had made its way south of Cleve, moving through the outskirts of Cleve to a crossroads just to the south. But the rest of its division was stuck in the traffic jams. In Cleve, small German units were fighting hard against the British, so by the end of the third day the Canadians were pushing forward in the north and the 51st in the south. But in the central areas in Cleve and the Heights, they were bogged down, and their reserves yet again were still stuck in this 20-kilometre traffic jam. The US 9th Army's Operation Grenade should have now been attacking in the areas towards Wesel from the south, but were still stuck behind the Ruhr. The Germans were using this to put more units in front of Canadian 1st Army and 30 Corps. Operation Veritable was planned to last 4 to 5 days to get to the Rhine in front of Wesel. But delays in Cleve and traffic jams put pay to these plans, and the Germans were moving more and more armour into the area. The 47th Panzer Corps were given over to command of the 1st Parachute Army. These were the Green Devils, paratroopers, not the old and the young that Canadian Army had been fighting earlier in the battle. The Germans, using the 47th Panzer Corps, tried to counterattack on the 5th day to retake Cleve and via the Reichsfeld Forest, but the 15th Scottish, 43rd Wessex Division and the 53rd Welsh prevented the Germans getting to their objectives, and the Germans pulled back to the high ground to the east of Cleve. The Canadians were pushing hard east along the flooded areas north of Cleve and used smoke to cover their advances. 51st Highland Division captured Gnap and Heckens, opening the road from Nijmegen to Cleve to relieve these horrendous traffic jams and bring up more reserves and stores. General Carrera, commanding Veritable, split the front into 2 corps areas. The Canadians would slog it out west of the Rhine towards Wesel, and the 30 Corps advanced south towards Gok and Gelden, now reinforced with 52nd Lowland Division. By day 10, 43rd Wessex Division, after hard fighting, punched a hole through the German lines on the high ground towards Gok, again using kangaroos. They did not bypass Gok, but spent 3 hard days house-to-house fighting with the Germans before taking the town. After 14 days in the front from Gok to Kalka towards the Rhine, the Germans held Canadian Army and 30 Corps and thrown their strongest army reserves in, the Panzer Lehr Division. But the Allies had huge reserves and now air power, and these were now bringing into play. The floodwaters were also going down on the Ruhr, and the US 9th Army, at last, after a long delay, would come into the battle with Operation Grenade. Prior to the US 9th Army crossing the Ruhr, the Germans had weakened the sector to send more units to bolster German 1st Parachute Army in front of Canadian 1st Army. This gave the US 9th Army a golden opportunity, with the floods receding, to get on with Operation Grenade. For 10 days approx, 1st Canadians and the German 1st Parachute Army had been in a mini war of attrition, but every lost Allied soldier and tank could be replaced. But every lost German was not. There'd been a number of mistakes on the Allied part. First, too many units in the initial attack on the start line from the Rhine to the Maas. This contributed to the terrible and massive traffic jam. Second, Horrocks bringing in the 43rd Division too early. The third, the 43rd Division, taking Gok and wasting 3 days and not using the opportunity to go south. And the fourth, the worst of all, in the middle of this tough battle, politics came into being, in who would have the glory of pushing to Wesel. We shall now look at Operation Blockbuster. Leader of the Canadian 2nd Corps, General Simmons, who had been temporarily in charge of the Canadian 1st Army during the Battle of the Scheldt, came up with a plan for an armoured push into the Germans' last line of defence, the Schlieffen Line or the Hochfeld Forest ridges. This was Operation Blockbuster, to take the town of Xanten before getting to Wesel, rather than going down the main road near the Rhine. The redeployed 43rd Wessex Division would push along the Rhine, protecting the left flank of the attack. Canadian 3rd and 2nd Divisions would use infantry to break the first line of German units on the Eitz before the main Huckfeld Ridge. Then 4th Canadian Armoured Division would rush the gap on the Huckfeld Ridge. Our old friends 11th Armoured Division, with their new A34 Comet tanks, would then push on the right flank towards the town of Sonsbeck. General Schlimm of the 1st Parachute Army now knew the prime target was Wesel and had his best Green Devil paratroopers protecting the Huckfeld Gap along with valuable assault guns. Now for politics. 30 Corps to the right of the line would outflank the Siegfried Line, were now facing open country to the south with the potential of an easier route and quickly to meet the US 9th Army's lead elements. Was prevented for 24 hours from proceeding with his attack. General Creras' subordinate Canadian Corps and Divisional commanders had lobbied in to let the Canadians have the glory. As you can see from the map behind me, 30 Corps were in a much better position, facing fewer German units with open country. On the 23rd of February, US 9th Army finally started Operation Grenade, some 13 days late, but made good progress against weakened German forces, and once across the Ruhr threw caution to the wind by releasing 3 massive armoured columns with no regards to flank protection and limiting supporting infantry. Within 3 days they had a bridgehead some 32 kilometres wide and 18 kilometres deep, and were pounding the weakened German 15th Army, who, the ones who legged it from the Scheldt in earlier episodes, quickly collapsed, leaving the US armour to push ahead. General Schlimm, the German 1st Parachute Army commander, had started pulling units away from the Canadian 1st Army and 30 Corps to try to block the Americans. Hitler refused any retreat and would not give him any further forces to aid his situation, leaving him in a terrible and unwinnable position. At 0400 hours on the 26th of February 1945, day 19 of the battle, Operation Blockbuster started in tough conditions. The Canadians advanced some 7 kilometres, taking the first line of German defences, with a loss of about 40 tanks, and many stuck in the mud. But the Canadian infantry showed great fighting spirit and pushed hard into the Germans. This managed to release the main strike force of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, but they struggled to get their units in place, and the prospect of attacking across a waterlogged valley and onto the Huckfeld Heights and determined German opposition. Trenches and barbed wire, then a long muddy climb up to the Huckfeld Gap, and the prize of overlooking Xanten and the road to Wesel. The German paratroopers, the Green Devils, fought with determination as tank after tank was knocked out on the slopes up to the gap, and the supporting infantry in bitter fights with German paratroopers. Canadian casualties were horrendous, as you can see by the clip behind me, the actual gap in the forest that the Canadians were forced to fight through. The Germans were also counter-attacking the gap, but the Canadians fought them off after bitter fighting. But by day 21, the Canadian armoured advance had stopped, but they had almost reached the end of the Huckfeld Gap. General Schlimm then pounded the gap with the largest concentration of artillery and mortars and rockets in the west, and the poor Canadians were literally ripped apart. Canadian 3rd and 2nd Infantry Divisions were now fighting on the flanks in the forest, but were held up with small numbers of the most elite German paratroopers with MG42 machine guns and the new automatic weapons such as the MP44 Sturmgewehr or assault rifle, the father of all modern infantry weapons. What price to pay for Canadian glory? Across the rest of the Canadian front, the attacking 11th Army Division was struggling against the German resistance in front of Sonsbeck, and only the 43rd Wessex were making progress on the left flank on the Rhine, clearing out any German resistance, No matter how hard this was, the Allies were getting stronger and the Germans were getting weaker. Further south, the US 9th Army's armoured columns pushed towards unchecked, and 30 Corps were now pushing down from the south, advancing towards the Americans. Hitler finally relented and let Schlemm pull back to a bridgehead from the Uckveld southeast along the Rhine in front of Wesel, and protecting the escape route across the Rhine bridges in this area. The Germans did not retreat in a rout, but a disciplined retreat at night to the new bridgehead, and the last act of Operation Veritable and Grenade. On about day 24, the Germans were pushed back into a new bridgehead. The 43rd Wessex were pushing hard towards Xanten. The Canadians, at massive cost, were at last through the Huckfeld Gap and pushing again towards Xanten. Sonsbeck was taken by the 11th Army Division, plus 3rd Canadian and 3rd British Infantry Divisions. Guards Armoured and the 53rd Welsh fought and cleared the ridges overlooking the Rhine and Wesel. The US Army, pushing from the south in low country to the east of the ridge, taken by Guards Armoured and 53rd Welsh. But it would take another week's bitter fighting to clear the Germans out of this bridgehead. The Germans were in a now small, dense area protected by masses of 20mm AA guns, so thick that Allied close air support was withdrawn, as Typhoons and Spitfire 16s were being knocked out the sky or coming back like cheese graters. The last 4 days saw intensive fighting, including getting over a deep anti-tank ditch and fierce fighting in the towns near the river, with the Germans' rearguard fighting to the very last to let most of the Germans get away over the last bridges across the Rhine, destroying them in a very disciplined withdraw and fighting retreat, making the Allies pay for every foot as the bridgehead got smaller and smaller. By the 11th of March, Operation Veritable and Grenade were over, but at immense cost. Some 23,000 Allied casualties on an operation that should have been taken in 4 to 5 days, but took over 30 days. Here is the BBC correspondent talking about the end of Operation Veritable.
Hello BBC. This is Chester Wilmot speaking from Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters. The German bridgehead west of the Rhine, opposite Wesel, has been wiped out. Yesterday afternoon, 3 columns of Canadian, British and American troops reached the western end of the 2 bridges which the Germans had blown yesterday morning. The end was sudden and swift. On Friday evening, the Germans were still resisting strongly, holding a line across the neck of the bend on which Wesel stands. But during the night, they evidently withdrew the bulk of their forces, and when Montgomery's troops attacked yesterday morning, they found little more than rearguard parties covering roadblocks.